Greetings, everybody. My name is Jeff Norby, and I'd like to welcome you to this spotlight lecture on the normal distribution and group differences in intelligence. And before we look at any group differences, we have to have a base understanding of what is called the normal distribution. And to get a sense of what that is, we'll look at these 50 women here and 50 different heights of 50 different women. And we'll take those heights and we'll put them into what's called a frequency distribution. And you can see already from the frequency distribution that there's a congregation of women of middle heights. If we graph this, it's going to look a little bit like a bell, and this is what we call a normal distribution, with most women having an average height in the middle and only a handful being out in the extremes, extremely short and extremely tall. Okay. If we idealize this, it looks like this, and this is what we call a bell curve. It's a normal distribution. In this case, it's the results of the Wechsler Intelligence Score, Wechsler Intelligence Scale, excuse me. And we see here that there's a mean of 100, and that one standard unit of deviation, the average amount of deviation from the mean, is 15 points. So going up, it's 115, 130, and 145, and going down, it's 85, 70, and 55. Most importantly here, what I want you to see is that 68% of all persons fall within one standard unit, one standard deviation from the mean, either 15 up or 15 down. And if we go 2 standard units out, that encapsulates 95% of the people. Okay? So there's just a small percentage below 70 and a small percentage above 130. These are the extremes. And the only reason we have extremes is because most people are normal. This is not a law, but on most human attributes, it turns out that most people gravitate towards the middle, and it's this fact that by definition most people are normal that we have extremes. In this case, gifted persons on the right side and persons with intellectual disabilities or given consideration for intellectual developmental disability down on the left-hand side. So when we look at group differences, we could look at gender, we could look at groups by state, we could look at countries, we could look at race, ethnicity, you name it, we could look at it. We'll just look at 2 here, and we'll start with gender. Historically, there's been a slight difference between girls and boys, girls outpacing boys in verbal abilities, reading, spelling, and boys outpacing girls in visual spatial tasks, math and science, and the differences between genders are small, but historically they have existed. Below you see a classic visual and spatial task where people are asked to pick the 2 objects on the right that match the standard on the left, and you can see the 2 correct ones here. This is something that males historically have done a little bit better on. But when we look at group differences, here is what we need to consider. Within group differences are not the same as between group mean differences. So to understand this, you have to have a good grip on how a mean score, an average score, is constructed. So let's imagine that we were giving this test on visual and spatial tasks. On the left we have a population of 1,000 males, and on the right we have a population of 1,000 females. Down at the bottom of their circles you see their mean scores. That mean was calculated by taking the scores of all 1,000 persons in that group, adding them, and dividing by 1,000. Okay? That means that there are persons in the male group, males, who have a score lower than 103, and persons with a score that's much higher than 103, but the average is 103. If you look at between the groups, the between group difference is 4 points, 103 to 99. And we ask this question, what does that tell us about Bob or Lynn? And the answer is, it tells us nothing about Bob or Lynn. But a mistake that is frequently made is that people make inferences about Bob and Lynn based on the group means, and you can't do that. We have no information about Bob. He could very well have scored lower, much lower perhaps, than the female mean. And the same with Lynn is related to the male mean. Notice that Rich and Stan are separated by 5 points, which is more than the difference between the group means. And Cass and Gert are separated by 9 points, which is much more than the difference between the group means. This is typically the case. Within group differences are typically larger than between group means. That is, there may be a difference between males and females on visual and spatial tasks, but if you really want to find a difference, locate any 2 males or any 2 females, and those individual within group differences are typically going to be larger. Here's another area of even greater interest, and that is of race and IQ scores. Here the groups we're looking at are racial groups. And before we start this, important to note that the full range of IQ scores, everything you could imagine, is seen in all racial groups and all ethnic groups. But if we take these 4 groups right here, Asian, White, Hispanic, and African Americans, there are group differences. And the difference that's attracted the most attention is the difference between Black Americans and White Americans. Most likely because of the history of our country, and because there's such a large disparity. There's a 10 to 15 point disparity here depending on the scale that's used. So there is no argument that there is a difference. The question is, why is there a difference? And there are 4 different ideas that we could explore here, and I'll just address the first 2, and your teacher in class may address the 3rd and the 4th one here. Historically, it was thought that these differences must be genetic, that racial differences are the result of heredity. And, of course, intelligence is highly heritable. We know this. This book that you see here, The Bell Curve, popularized this a bit. It was controversial. This is a very controversial book. The book implied the message that disadvantaged groups and minority groups cannot avoid their fate because it's their genetic destiny. Of course, today, virtually all scientists agree that intelligence is influenced by genes. However, it's not agreed that group differences are genetic. In fact, most all scientists deny that as a fact. And instead, they look at number 2 here, the social and economic standing of disadvantaged groups and the differences that different groups have, the different opportunities that different groups have. And I'll give you just two ideas here, 2 pieces of evidence. First, we know this: the average African American has about 20% European genes, but those who have more European genes are no smarter than those who have fewer, which is what you'd expect if European genes made people intelligent. And second, it's found that Black children who are adopted in the first year of their life into a white family typically score an average of 20 points higher when they're compared to children raised in the Black community, where we know that economic deprivation is more common. If you look at Black Americans versus white Americans in comparison to European Americans, African Americans have fewer years of education, they have lower quality health care, they're more likely to face prejudice, discrimination, lower birth weights, attend worse schools, they're 3 times more likely to live in single-parent homes, they have higher rates of chronic illness. There is a disadvantage from one group to the other. The opportunities are not the same. Well, this then brings up the question, if intelligence is highly heritable, and we know that it is, how can the difference between 2 groups be completely environmental? Again, take a close look at this question at the top of the screen. This can be very confusing. How can group differences on a trait that we know is highly heritable be completely environmental? Well, we can use a little analogy here from the Civil War and the Vietnam era to explain this. If you were to go to a Civil War museum and look at uniforms, you would notice variation in sizes. Most men then varied between about 5'2" and 5'6", with an average of 5'4", 5 feet 4 inches. There's variation. Then, just as now, tall fathers typically had tall sons. Shorter fathers typically had shorter sons. There was variation, and that within group variation was due to heritability, was due to genetic variation. And if you go 100 years down the road into the 1960s and look at Vietnam uniforms, again, there are differences within the group. Okay? Men are now taller, but there's differences within the group. If researchers looked at the Vietnam uniforms, they'd find high heritability, but the average height would be several inches taller. It wouldn't be 5'4", it might be 5'9" or 5'10". So in this case, the heritability in the Civil War group and the Vietnam group is high. But the mean difference between the two from 1865 to 1965 is entirely environmental. And the environmental factor here at play is most likely a difference in nutrition as people are getting taller. So this is just a brief introduction for you. There's some fascinating issues here in the intelligence chapter and individual differences. I hope this gets you off to a good start, and please enjoy your studies on intelligence and individual differences.